Autocorrect is always good, except when you're doing genetics. All right, this is Norris Teaches Science Today, another biology edition video. We're starring me, Mr. Norris. Today I present genotypes and phenotypes. And so by the end of this video, I'm hoping you can say I can explain genotypes and phenotypes by identifying which are dominant or recessive. So we talked in the past on the previous video in this series about Mendel and what he did in his first two conclusions, the rule of factor, where you get half your DNA from your mother and half from your father. And we talked about the rule of dominance, where you have dominant and recessive traits, and dominant is always shown as present. And to have a recessive trait, you need to have two recessive genes or alleles. So we're going to continue on talking about Mendel's conclusions. He had four that we need to talk about. And the third conclusion Mendel had was called the law of segregation. The law of segregation says that for every individual has two alleles or letters for each trait, one from mom, one from dad, and gametes get one of those alleles. Think about meiosis. Remember, in meiosis, you only get half the chromosomes than your body cells. That's because the other half will come from another gamete when fertilization happens. So it's going back to the whole, you get 50% of your DNA in your traits from your mother, 50% from your father. And then you also have Mendel's fourth conclusion, which stated that the law of independent assortment, each gene is inherited independently of other genes. What that means is just because you have blonde hair does not mean you're going to have blue eyes. You can have blonde hair and you can have green eyes. You can have blonde hair and you have brown eyes. You have blue eyes and red hair. They are inherited all independent from each other. So just because you have one trait does not mean you'll have the other trait. So everything's inherited independently. That's why sometimes fraternal twins will have different traits, even if they're both female, because of the independent assortment. The only time that twins look identical are when they're identical twins. And twins form differently. Identical twins form from one egg, one sperm, while fraternal twins form from two sperm, two eggs. So that's how that works. So how do we represent dominant and recessive alleles? This is where we're going to get into dominant and recessive traits. So we use letters to represent the dominant alleles for each. We use letters to represent the different alleles for each trait. So remember, you have a dominant trait and a recessive trait. You use the same letter for each trait. So say we're talking about being brown eyes and blue eyes. Brown eyes and green eyes. Let's just say that. We're not going to use different letters here. We're going to use the same letter. The dominant trait will get the capital letter, which will be a capital B here. And recessive trait will get the lowercase letter, the lowercase b. So going back to Mendel's experiment, remember the purple and white flowers? Remember, purple was dominant over white. A capital P would be purple, and a lowercase p will represent white. So let's try this out real quick. So it says, in humans, brown eyes are dominant to green eyes. So we're looking what would the letter look for dominant and what will look for the letter look for recessive. Here's the thing. You always use the first letter of the dominant trait. The dominant trait here is brown, so we're going to use the letter B. So brown is dominant to green, so the dominant one will be capital B, and that would be brown. And the recessive would be the lowercase b, and that would be green. And so that's how we will write alleles right now. Now, these are what's going to come in is when we talk about stuff called genotypes and phenotypes. So genotypes are the actual combination of alleles on chromosomes. So we're going to use letters. When we use when we write genotypes, it's going to be two letters because remember, you get one from each of your parents. So say we are using letter T, you would have big T, big T, big T, little t, or little t, little t. Those would be the letters. So my example here is height. Big T is going to be tall, little t is going to be short. So big T, tall is dominant to short. Now we can write them different ways. If it's big T, we call that homozygous dominant. How you know that is homo prefix means same, and dominant means a capital letter. Little t is called homozygous recessive. Homo means same size, and recessive means small letter, little t. The last one is big T, and that's heterozygous. And the prefix hetero means different. So that means you're going to have one big and one little letter. So let's practice this real quick. We're going back to those, that same thing. In humans, brown eyes are dominant to green eyes. So we're going to use the letter big B for dominant trait and lowercase b for the recessive trait. So it says homozygous dominant. Homo means same, so we know we're going to use the same size letters. And dominant tells us we're going to use the dominant letter, which is big B. So we would write this genotype big B, big B. The next one, homozygous recessive. Homo means the same size. Recessive means we're going to use the recessive size letter, which is lowercase b. So 2 lowercase b's. The last one is heterozygous, and that is big B, little b, because hetero means different, so you have to use one of each size. All right. What goes along with genotypes is that we can look at genotypes and determine the phenotype of the person, or the actual physical characteristic, or the actual trait you would see on the outside. And so phenotypes are determined by the genotype. So you have to know your genotype to know your phenotype. So let's practice real quick. If you remember, we just did this. It says in humans, brown eyes are dominant to green eyes. So we had homozygous dominant, and we wrote that big B, big B. So since there's a big letter in here, at least one big letter, we're going to have to give it the dominant trait. And according to here, the dominant trait is brown. So this person would have brown eyes. Homozygous recessive, remember we wrote that as little b, little b. If you look, there's no big letter in here. Since there's no big letter, we're going to have to give it the recessive trait. And the recessive trait in here is green. So this phenotype would be green eyes based off its genotype. The last one is heterozygous. It was big B, little b. We have at least one big letter in here. When you have at least one big letter, you have to give the dominant trait to it. So that means it's going to have brown eyes. And so that's how genotypes and phenotypes work together with alleles and what Mendel discovered. Now, we're going to take this even further into the next video in genetics, where we're going to actually do something called Punnett squares. But I hope you learned something today, and this is Mr. Norris, and he is signing out.